Hey guys, Stockaholics, I appreciate you guys for being here today. Today I am going to be talking about the copper market, some of the things that I have noticed over this crazy year. I would also like to say, not suggest, say that this is not advice. Don't do something that I'm doing just because I'm doing it. Make your own decisions. I am just some dude on the internet. But that being said, I think that I have some information that might be able to give you guys a more informed opinion on some things. Okay, so I wanted to start today, talk a little bit about copper price, some history, and see if we can draw any inferences from that. Now, in any case, today the price of copper is around $3.55, at least at the time of recording this video. Might be a little bit higher than that, a little bit lower than that. Right now, I don't know. But I wanted to start, I guess, in the 60s. Oh, that was a long time ago. But in any case, you can see from the 60s to about the year 2000, the prices in copper, they were kind of gradually increasing. And you would also notice that there's some massive spikes in price. Until at the year about 2000, you'll notice, however, the price of copper just went parabolic. It shot out of that range and spiked as high as almost $4. Now you can see ever since around 2005 to today, copper has been trading in a much higher range. We could say that the low of copper might be around $2, and we might even say that the high of copper in that range might be around $4. Now this is some rudimentary analysis on my part, but in my personal opinion, if I was going to, based on this data that we've seen roughly the last 15 years, I would say that if we were above $3 in price, that would be expensive copper. And if we were below $3 in price, that would be cheaper copper. So if we're below $3, that might be where we would look to buy. And if it was above $3, well, that might be where we would look to sell. Now, there is some interesting things that I noticed here as well. If you look in these shaded sections, every one of these is a recession. You'll notice in a lot of these, the copper price is spiking quite a bit in some of these, and then about halfway through the recession comes crashing down. You can see that in a lot of these. Or you'll notice that the price either just completely goes straight down without having a spike. Now you can see the same thing happened in the GFC around here. Price went from about $3 to $4 before rapidly plummeting, right? Now you could also say that we are in a recession right now, and that the price from March has gone from about $2 to about $3.70, right? That's at the high. Or today at $3.55, it did pull back a little bit, right? If we're thinking about that in terms of things that happened in the past, that might be something to be a little worried about. There's a couple other things I wanted to briefly mention before I go on. This spike here, why we're trading in these $2 to $4 ranges instead of down here, you can think of for a couple of reasons, or at least I do. One of those is technology, right? You think about technology over time, a lot of that has an electrical component, and copper is used in a lot of electronics and things of those nature. And the more nations around the world become industrialized and use technology, the more demand that there is for copper. This spike right here is largely attributed to the development of China as a nation. So it went from an agrarian society all the way to a successful country. On top of that, the grades in copper have been gradually declining. Now, I mentioned this before in the last copper video. So while we've simultaneously seen growth and demand around the world in terms of technology, in terms of copper usage, the supply in terms of the availability, the grade of the copper in the ground has been declining. Now I want to briefly show you guys this as well. This was world copper consumption in 2019, courtesy of Statistica. You can see here this blue segment, which kind of blows my mind if you look at it. 51% of world copper usage in the entire world. China used half of all of the copper in 2019. Now, not all of this was for Chinese development, which I mentioned before. Some of that has to do with the nature of Chinese economy, and they have an export-driven market. A lot of their things that they produce use copper in them, and they may export some of that copper as well, right? You can also see that Asia over here has roughly 20%. And these two markets right here, Asia and China, has been growing pretty rapidly for many years now. Yeah, you can see Europe and America are using roughly 17 and 12% respectively, and Africa and some oceanic countries roughly 1%. Now I would expect this segment here to change over time. I think that these countries are going to become more and more developed. They're going to want this wonder material for transmitting electricity as they become more electrified as well, and they may become more like Asia. Now on the flip side, I would expect Europe and Americas to decline somewhat in their copper consumption. Now I do understand that there is, at least relative to the other nations, I do understand that there's demand for electric vehicles, and that does have some it does increase the use of that material, both in the vehicles themselves and through the electric grid, right? And even if you're thinking about renewables too. So, but do I think that's going to compare as much to the other growth that we see in these areas that are just becoming electrified? Maybe not. Now, there's one thing I'd also like to mention. Since early this year, China's economy has rebounded. I think I've read a few places that it would suggest that if we're looking at a chart like this, this copper consumption would be even higher than 51%, and that these numbers over here in Europe and America will be even lower. And I think that has a lot to do with the way that these nations have responded to the coronavirus. I would say that Asian countries and some other countries around the world have responded to it in less draconian terms, and as a result have had less of an impact on their economies. In Europe and America, on the other hand, we see a lot of these shutdowns and those kinds of things, and I think those are going to have dramatic impacts both right now in terms of copper demand and in the near future, as these countries learn to come to grips with the economic realities of these measures that they have taken. Now I want to show you guys this very briefly, in case you guys didn't know. These are the top 5 copper producers. This will be important in a second when I show you guys a couple of graphs. First of all, the top producer in the world currently is Chile, followed not even closely by Peru, then China, United States, then the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now you can see here, these are the supplies from these 3 countries, Chile, Peru, and the United States. Chile, remember, has about twice as much production as some of those other top 5 countries. And over here we have Peru and the United States. I wanted to say, I expected when I was doing some of this research to see large supply disruptions this year because of COVID. And I do think that there are some supply disruptions, but they're not nearly as large as I personally anticipated them to be. And I can kind of show you that. So first of all, Chile, you can see in 2019 there was a dip in the early part of the year below the range that we've seen this year. I believe this is in thousands of metric tons, so they average around probably 500,000 metric tons. And this year we've actually had a reasonably normal year in Chile in terms of the copper production. Now Peru, their exports are smaller compared to Chile, but they're important. They've been significantly smaller. They were much more impacted, I guess, in terms of their response to the virus than Chile was. Now, one thing to notice in this chart in Chile briefly is that in 2019, they had this large dip here, and that in 2020, even with the virus, we didn't even reach that low in the early part of the year that they did the year prior. So that's a little crazy. Now although this dip might look way massive compared to this one, remember the amount of copper that Peru produces is a lot less than Chile. So if you think about this dip compared to this dip right here, the difference is probably mute. It's maybe a slight decline in copper production. Yeah. Over here's the United States, another relatively large producer of copper. What's interesting is that you think the United States' information would be a little bit easier to find. I had to dig through some kind of scientific journals to try and find this stuff. A lot of it is because in terms of economic data in the United States, they're coagulating a lot of the mineral data. So they'll combine, copper with zinc and all those other kinds of minerals that I don't really care about. But in any case, so I found this, and it only goes up to August this year, but you can still kind of see a general pattern here. And it's generally that we're still in a relatively normal range, even in terms of COVID. Now, it was slightly impacted in February, but oddly enough, it didn't decline in March and April when you're thinking about COVID shutdowns, which is kind of crazy. But in any case, it kind of stayed flat around this 3.5 range. Now, yeah, I would say that it's a little bit smaller overall, but in any case, where you do start to see some impact is in terms of the refineries. So maybe there is some kind of a supply side disruption going on, but we don't see it in terms of the mine output, but perhaps instead in terms of the factories. This is a cool article that I read. It kind of sums up a lot of the ideas we're noticing in the copper market. This is from Priscilla Barrera, written a few days ago from copperinvestingnews.com. Now, obviously, I think that they have probably a more bullish bias, so I would keep that in mind. But in any case, I'll read through this article. Speaking about surprises in 2020, Charlie Durant of the CRU Group told the INN that the fall and subsequent China-led recovery in the London Metal Exchange 3-month copper price was dramatic. So like I mentioned before, we are seeing demand and the economic situation in these Asian countries getting back to more normal levels. Now, the question is, does that really last, in my mind, in terms of economic output? Because if we're thinking about China, they're a net exporter of goods, and their major clients are the United States in particular and the European Union. So if these two places continue to do policies that damage their local economies, the question is, does that impact China, in my mind? But again, before I get too far off track, and anyway, I think that the most interesting part of this story has been how quickly Chinese purchasing recovered and how much metal has been sucked into China. So China has been on kind of a crazy commodity buying spree this year. They had a stimulus very early in the year, and I think a lot of that went into these sort of commodity kinds of programs. We've seen this similar thing when crude oil went very low. China just went on a mass buying spree, buying tons of this stuff. And the same has been true for copper. So the question is, is that kind of, is that causing this massive jump in the price that we've seen? Or is that price that we've seen actually world demand? Or is it just some kind of temporary spike? Yeah. This guy believes the market is overextended at the moment and that he expects a pullback at some point in the next month or so. But he believes that overall positive sentiment looks set to prevail into 2021, with the vaccine providing hope for stronger recovery in demand. So I believe that it is too. I believe that the market is overextended, but I've noticed some of the patterns that I've noticed in the chart in terms of historical data. And I don't really share this belief that vaccines are just going to cause an instant economic rebound. Yeah, our stimulus check's going to, maybe provide some short-term inflation. Yeah, probably, maybe will that lead to some more goods and purchases and services being bought in the economy in the short term? Maybe, but the question is, does it bring back jobs? Does it bring back businesses? We're at record, at least in terms of the United States, and I think it's a similar situation in Europe. Does it bring back the hundreds of thousands of businesses that have been permanently shut down? Does it bring back the millions of jobs that have been lost? Yes and no. Maybe over time it could provide a small contribution to that. The economy is kind of like an oil tanker. I think I've said this before. It takes a long time for this to turn around, and it takes the equal amount of time to even notice that the ship has even turned. So I still believe that we're still noticing the ship being turned, even with the stimulus, even with all of those things. And eventually it's going to turn around. It's going to get worse, but eventually it's going to get better, I think. So I don't share this personal optimistic view of the market. Though with such a slump outside of China in 2020, much of the incremental growth, global growth for 2021 is actually contingent on a rebound outside of the Asian country. So if we do see continued growth in Asia, that's one thing, but we do need to see at least consistent growth in Western nations, yeah. But there is some other countries that we could see some rebound, and one of those is India. Although vaccines will not resolve the pandemic in Q1, expect the encouraging vaccine news to provide a boost of confidence and spending in Europe and the US, which has led to us to raise our economic growth forecasts in the first quarter of 2021. So some people are more bullish than me. Barring unforeseen disruptions, we are forecasting growth of around 300,000 tons in Peru in 2021. Now that's a lot. So if we do see, with these price hikes recently, we see some increased production in the countries that are able to produce it, but we don't see that there's actual demand from these price hikes, then that would likely have provide a deprecating factor for the price, at least in the short and medium term, for the material. Yeah. Chilean production held up relatively well this year, and we saw that in one of those graphs before, yeah, and is expected to post reasonable growth next year despite the earlier reduction in guidance for Escondida in the year to the end of June. So I guess this is one of their mines that was shut down earlier in the year, and they expect that to come back online. This is the weakening dollar versus increasing copper price. Thought this was something interesting to show you guys. This red line is the US dollar index, DXY, and the blue is a copper futures index. To make it simple, we'll just say that this is copper price over time. Now over here, we would say that this would be March, where we see a steep sell-off in coppers and a massive flight to safety in the US dollar. However, ever since, we have seen a declining dollar in the DXY, and then we've seen a large surge in the price of copper. This is a pattern that happens for most of the time with copper and the US dollar. They tend to trade inverse of each other. So if you believe that the dollar is going to keep going down and down and down, is going to go to zero, then copper might be a great way to play that, as probably most commodities would be, right? I don't personally share that view. I've made this video when I'm talking about bonds and my logic around the economy and those kinds of things. I think a lot of this is, at least, and that's my opinion, a lot of this is based on, I think, investor psychology. I think there's a general belief that stimulus and the Federal Reserve and all of these kinds of entities and bills and these kinds of things have been inflationary in nature, but they don't to me they don't seem to account for the actual state of the economy, which I believe it is, and I do believe that the stimulus is inflationary in the very short term. They don't account for the massive disruption in society that the virus and governments have had on, at least in the United States, in terms of the dollar. And I think that ultimately the effects will manifest, and there will be deflationary ones. Now, if you don't share that view, I get it. The inflation deflation debate is extremely complicated, but in any case, this would be something interesting to show you guys. So if you wanted to play on a weakening dollar, this would be probably one of the commodities to do that in. Now here's a little more on what do I think. Some of the data that we looked at, it supports the idea that we could be in a copper bull market. So there was some very slight disruption this year in copper, all things considered, and we've seen relatively robust world demand in the second half of 2020, which has caused that, at least it has to have caused that difference or that price spike that we've seen this year. So this tells me in the future that if we see some supply shocks, that could be very big for copper prices. Let's say a mine or two shuts down in Chile or Peru, or something goes a little, not so great in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or let's say that environmental regulations in the United States get even more strict. That's one of the things I'd be more concerned of, personally, looking at the Western zeitgeist and being in the United States. If one of these things kind of happens, it shows me that the market is really tight. And you see one of these things on the supply side kind of disrupt the picture, it could cause the price of copper to really, really spike up. I think China has stockpiled a lot of copper in the short term at low prices, so they've been stockpiling this, kind of like that they've done with oil over the year. Now this might be in anticipation of a rebound later in the future and just taking advantage of some lower prices early in the year. Considering their economy depends on exports, however, question in my mind is, will the US and Europe lockdowns affect copper demand next year? I kind of do. I believe we have not yet seen the full effects of these something policies on the economy, and when the stimulus high has ended, maybe we can see where we are at. Now, if Chinese demand alone can cause such a spike in copper price, perhaps the outlook for copper over the next decade could be much higher than we think. I think that the potential for copper could be very high, especially when we see world economies get back to normal, when they get over this nonsense, right? Now, this is what I've done. The week before last, I took profits on a lot of my copper positions. The copper price and these stocks had just moved up so much, so fast. It just felt the prudent thing for me to do, to take profit on those. So I already took profits on about 50% of my copper positions on this last rally. During recessions, like I showed you in the first slide, we've seen that there are some tendency for copper prices to absolutely plummet after a period where it rallies. Yeah. So for me, that's something that I'm a little bit nervous about, and something I'm going to be watching. Now, one of the things I noticed that causes these kinds of things is that there tends to be deflation during recessions. So one way I can monitor that is I'm going to be watching the DXY closely. It's the dollar index. Yeah. Currently, we can see, and I'm not greatest on technical analysis, but these are my thoughts. There is some strong support where we are now in the dollar. So we're in kind of like a critical period here. And what it tells me is that if we can't hold this level between, let's say, the 91 and 80, maybe a little lower than here, the 88 level for the DXY, then that probably signals to me that that copper is going to go up, and then I'm going to probably hold my positions, the copper positions that I have. However, if this area bounces, and I think that there is a possibility that could happen, then I'm probably going to sell a lot of my copper positions. Now, I do want to say that I am long-term bullish on copper, but a lot of this rally personally doesn't make too much sense to me, considering the global economic situation. There's I talked a lot about that already, and I like to say one more time, economies are like oil tankers. They're slow, and they take a lot of time to turn around. And copper is just, one of those resources that's just so closely tied to world GDP. In any case, if you made it this far, thank you so much for being here, and let me know in the comments below, what do you think about copper or any of my ideas? Are they stupid or are they amazing? Let me know. All right.